All right guys, I gotta show you. I just got back from the powder coaters and I picked up my sump tank as well as the coolant reservoir tank that I had powder coated. So I gotta show you this. It came out awesome. So check this out. So as part of my plan for mounting the sump, I had to modify the rear firewall here. And here you can see I made this aluminum plate. It's somewhat angled so that the sump can go straight up from the lower side of the chassis, straight up and fit and tuck nicely into that firewall. So here you can see the end result of that modification, again, to that fiberglass firewall. Fits in nicely. It's just behind the driver's seat, tucks in there nicely. That'll all get carpeted ultimately, so that'll be covered up. You probably won't even notice it. Here it is, permanently mounted to the rear fiberglass firewall. Use some washers in there to make it nice and secure with the rivets. So here is the coolant surge tank as well as overflow tank. I picked this up on Summit. It's an integrated unit, all in one. I just loved the simple profile nature of this, but check it out. Black wrinkle coat, powder coat finish on that. Super durable, just looks awesome. So that's the coolant reservoir. And then here is the sump tank. So, I mean, check this out. That just came out incredible. Quality of that coating. I got to give a shout out to my boys over at Spec Powder Coating. They just killed it. Again, 24 hours after dropping this thing off, less than 24 hours after dropping it off, it's back in my possession. So guys, you just continue to exceed expectations. So quick shout out to those guys. Based on feedback on I think episode 8, when I put this sump together, if you remember, I had a couple of hose clamps that were holding on a mounting bracket, and based on one of the viewers chimed in and said, hey, you should just weld up a bracket to look more OEM factory, and I did exactly that. So that you can see here, I actually reused the rubber grommets that came out of the R8 sump, so engineered it to fit those. So anyways, this thing, it just came out unbelievable. It's just super cool. And you know, if you notice, it matches the wrinkle coat on the Lambo intake plenum. So it'll all match when it's in the engine bay together. It's gonna match really, really nice and be just a subtle integration of the engine bay color scheme. So I'm gonna assemble this. I've got to put in the sight gauge here. I'm gonna put the drain plug bung in. And then I'm gonna mount it up into the chassis. So let's do that. Okay, there she is. Not for the final time. It's still got some work to do in here before we mount this in. So here how it sits. You can see now the sight gauge, this coolant hose will get cut much shorter and rerouted, but when the engine's in there, it'll be a nice sight line to quickly see the level of the oil in the sump. So that's what that sight gauge is for. Plenty of room to mount up the return line, the feed line down low, and then for the crankcase ventilation, one for each side will get mounted in there. And I've got a little kind of left to right adjustability in this sump, and depending on where the oil feed and where that meets up, somewhere in here where the engine connection is, I've got some adjustability in here, left-right adjustability. So I'm not gonna drill these holes. I'm gonna put some rib nuts in there. I'm not gonna put rib nuts in there quite yet. You can see the other one back there. Until I figure out exactly where that thing's gonna go. But looks really good in there. And then again, as I figure out what I'm gonna use for heat reflective material on that back bulkhead, put in the comments down below what you guys think. I kind of like the idea of the gold, but that's a lot of gold. I want to basically cover that entire rear bulkhead area, both the fiberglass and then the aluminum paneling down below. But I'm undecided yet what I want to do. Maybe just a silver foil looking or an aluminum. If you guys have any ideas or thoughts, chime in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys think. So that chapter of the sump is closed. That was a big piece I needed to figure out. So I've got a couple of fuel lines in already. I've got a short fuel line I made up here, -6 AN, braided hose with the nylon sheath to it. I just like the look of the black hose versus the stainless. I made up a nice little bracket here, you can see, bolted it to the frame, got a piece of rubber insulation sandwiched in between that bracket and the frame, and then I picked up this 50mm anodized machined bracket for the fuel filter. That's what you see here, and that will simply route a line back down into the engine bay. And I've got the hose coiled right here where I will, once I get the engine back in there, I'll get that line, that fitting set, and I'll show you on the engine where that will go. Basically right here. So this is the low pressure fuel supply line, and I put it's a barbed fitting to 6 AN male, so that line will bolt right there. All right, I'm getting ready to do the fuel lines here. I'm using stainless steel braided lines, PTFE lined, with the black nylon kind of sheath on it. I just like the color, the look of the black lines versus the raw stainless braided lines. So let me show you where I'm at, and then I'm gonna go ahead and start mounting these lines up. So here I've already got a bunch of lines made up. I'm gonna use all the ports on the Ultima tank, Ultima factory tank, on both sides. And you can see there the lines I've got in place. So I'm gonna route them there and then just on the underside as well. And you'll see in a moment what I'm gonna do there. Tuck them up out of the way, keep them away from any heat. So I'm gonna use the kind of the dip in the seat pan here. You can see the seat pan dips below kind of the frame rails. I'm actually gonna take these lines and fit them up, tuck them up underneath here, kind of beside the seat pan. If you remember too, I'm gonna do a skid plate on this, so that skid plate will actually start here at the edge, right at the edge of the seat pan, and then angle back towards that new cross member I put in place, so that, again, that skid plate underpan will give me a little bit of clearance under the frame rails here, and also provide some protection from these lines on how I'm going to route them. So let me show you what I'm using to mount up the fuel lines, the 6AN fuel lines. I picked up these 6AN aluminum hose clamps or hose mounts. It's threaded on one side, but what I'm doing is I'm just drilling through that 4mm drill bit just to take the threads out, and then I can pass through an M4 cap head bolt all the way through into a riv nut that is in the chassis. So that's how I'm using those. I bought, I don't know, 10 or so of these, and that's what I'll use to mount up the fuel lines. All right, so I'm getting ready to put the engine back in the car to do all the plumbing. I gotta plumb the fuel lines, coolant lines to the engine, as well as the factory OEM crankcase ventilation, which I'm gonna show you now. So let me go through a couple of these things, some of the engine modifications I made before I put the engine back in. So one of the first things I did was I removed these secondary air injection valves, one for each side of the engine, the left, the right, and where these would normally go would hook up right here into there's an exhaust passage that feeds into where the headers go, and there's one on each side. And the other end of these valves hooked up to an air injection pump. Again, 2 pumps. A lot of plumbing I just don't need. Obviously, all that's for emissions. Cold starting an engine, it pumps extra air in to help with the combustion. I don't need any of that. So I've removed it, and I just made a couple small 1/4-inch thick aluminum plates, cover plates, to just cover those holes where those secondary injection intake vent or passage was. Quick edit here. I'm very conscious of the environment and the effects of global warming, so by no means am I dissing emission standards here. It's just I'm going to put 2,000 miles a year maybe on this car, and probably a few dozen cold starts. So the impact on the environment should be very, 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 very small. So that was the first thing I did. Second thing I did, I decided not to use the air conditioning. Mostly because this is a convertible car. And in New England, I'm probably not going to need it that often. So I just decided to remove it, save some headache on all the plumbing that goes along with it. As far as taking some weight out of the engine, this air conditioning pump would sit right here on the engine. So that saves a lot of room on the side of the engine. Certainly helpful for the wire harness that I put together that now routes underneath alongside of the engine. The other thing, I bought some of this corrugated tubing here, and I'm going to use this for the crankcase ventilation. So this engine has a pretty decent factory crankcase ventilation setup that I'm going to try and reuse. There's one port here, and I turned this tube around. Normally it would point to this side of the engine. Remember that sump would sit on the R8 and the Huracan sits right about here. And so that tube routed to the top of the oil sump there. But since my oil sump now is on the other side of the engine against the bulkhead firewall here, I need to pull these crankcase ventilation lines back towards the other side of the engine. Now this factory line might be long enough to reach the top of these ports. It plugs into this rear port right here, and then the other port plugs into this port. So another reason why I tried to reuse the OEM top of the sump tank, because now it's just plug and play. I can reuse these fittings and lines. The other line I took off already, the other crankcase ventilation line I took off, actually cut the tube. I was trying to see if I could maybe modify this, extend it a little bit, but I'm going to just use this hose instead. But anyways, this line normally went right there, and then again plugged in the top of the original, on the top of the sump or the original location. So I'm going to reuse these fittings. I already took them apart. So I can reuse these fittings on this line. And I think what I'm going to do is just route the line from here kind of underneath the intake plenum. I think there's room to snake it under here, bring it all the way back, and come out under here somewhere. And then again, that will feed to this other port on the top of the sump. All right, we just got the engine back in the car, probably for the 10th time anyway. And I'm checking all the clearances for the sump, the coolant overflow tank, and then looking about all the lines. And man, it is tight in there. I forget how tight this really is when you start to just put everything together. Good news, the sump clears in here. I've already got the heater hoses kind of in the way, but a little bit of space in between. And then very down here, you got to see where I put that 16 AN fitting, and there's just clearance between it and the side of the sump. There's probably ½ an inch right there. So that plan came together. What else? Oh, underneath, when I connect those AN fittings to the bottom of the sump and to the engine, I'm going to have to create a loop with the 16 AN line. It's just those two points are just too close together. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but I think I can make that work. Let's see what else. My new cross member there that I welded in a couple episodes ago. You can see how the bottom of the engine is completely flat right there, as is the transmission that bolts to it. So still got some clearance there for a little bit of engine movement. Over on this side, you can see the integrated pressure tank, coolant pressure tank, and overflow tank all as one unit. Again, not a lot of room to spare, but just enough there. And I was just looking at fuel line, vacuum line, and coolant line from the front of the radiator. The crankcase ventilation line too. This is the factory one, and I think it's just long enough where it's supposed to go into that back port on that sump. But I think I can make that work. There's a little bit of slack in there, so I think I can make that work. And then the other crankcase, the other side of the crankcase, I have to plumb right here. And then I think I'm going to run it underneath the intake plenum to the back of the engine, and then that will go in the other side. So again, trying to reuse as many of these factory parts as possible. So that should work. The other thing I wanted to start to show you guys is it's getting closer to starting to fabricate the headers, the exhaust headers for this thing. So just to give you an idea of the space I'm working with, obviously the chassis angles towards the front. I've got the most space here and the tightest space for this first port there. But I think what I'll do is you can bring the runners back, angle them out, and then most of the header will sit out here and then route to the rear. I've seen a few turbocharged systems and long tube V8 headers in this car, and some folks have done some nice header work, and there's some room out here you can play with. So the key is just getting these runners out from under here and out in space here for the collector, and then out to the exhaust out the rear. So that's that side, and this side here, about the same space. Again, that exhaust port there, I'll just have to come out and run it back along here and then bring it out. So it'll be tight, but I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. I think I'm going to use the Ice Engine Works modeling kit, where you can model up your exhaust system. So I'll get it all modeled out first before I put it in place. And let me show you the exhaust flanges. Pull these out here. So the first thing I did was, and I'll have more of this on a video later, first thing I did was model them out in Fusion 360 and then 3D printed a set. And so this is the header flange that I basically copied off from the factory header setup. Just replicated it, printed it out, 3/8 inch thick, and it fits great on the chassis. Then what I did is I tried plasma cutting on my table, and it just didn't give a clean cut the way I wanted. So what I ended up doing was just sending my CAD design off to a laser cutting company, and they laser cut these flanges. So it looks really, really good. And then I machined and milled off, these little feet, these angled feet at these wedge attachment points, the way it wedges into the side of the block. So they came out super, super nice. So this is what I will ultimately be starting with for the exhaust header design. So that's that. So it won't be long before I will start working on these, on the exhaust system for this car. All right, I made a discovery on this engine further along than I had hoped. All right, we're gonna pause it right there. Tune into the next episode to find out what discovery I made. And hint, it's gonna require a bit more aluminum welding. See you next time.